I'm making pie crust today. I'm using a basic Betty Crocker recipe with some variants of my own. I have in this bowl for a 10-inch pie crust a cup and a third of just unbleached flour. I like King Arthur brand, but any will do. I already have a couple tablespoons of butter in, and what I'm using here is actually lard. And yes, everybody's going, oh, lard's so bad for you. Really, lard's no worse for you than hydrogenated shortening, and it makes a better tasting pie. There's also about a half a teaspoon of salt in with this, and everything is cold, cold, cold. You can see how hard it is to cut my flour or my butter and shortening into my flour. But what we're going to do is we're just going to actually work and cut this in. As you can see, the flour and the shortening is almost all cut in, and it's kind of in a little bit larger pieces. And I'm just going to finish, and all I do is kind of mash the shortening and the flour together, and it breaks it into smaller pieces. Don't overwork your shortening into your flour. Should not be one smooth lump. It should be very granular, chunky. As you can see, there's lots of little bits of fat. I use a fork. You can use a pastry cutter, but I've never saw the need for one. And then once it looks like kind of coarse crumbs in there, I'm going to start adding my ice water. Now, the recipe will call for 3 to 4 tablespoons for a 10-inch pie crust. I make more pie dough than I really need because I don't like a skimpy crust. So I'm going to start sprinkling my water in, and I'm going to start with 2 tablespoons. I often use more water than a recipe calls for. It's kind of a intuitive thing when the pie dough looks and feels moist enough. Sometimes flour is a little drier and it takes a little more moist or a little more water, and sometimes the flour is a little bit newer, a little bit moister, and you don't need as much. So as you can see, it's starting to get a little bit plumpier. So where the dry bits are, I'm going to pour a couple more tablespoons of water in, and I'm going to just keep mixing. And for me, as I'm mashing, it's getting bigger and firmer, coming together more, but I still have a lot of dry flour left in this, so I'm going to put a couple more in. I must always use more water than the recipes call for. Okay, just about there. As you can see, the start to come together. And yes, I do use my hands. My hands are clean. I washed them before I started. And the pie dough is going to bake, so if there was anything on my hands, the oven would sanitize, bake any bacteria out. That's about all the water I'm going to put in this. And now I'm going to kind of knead it together a little bit. You really need not to handle your pie crust very much. You really want to keep your hands light, the cold. The more warmth you use, the tougher your pie crust is going to be. And I'm having to work this just a little bit. It probably is a little bit dry for me, and I can always just add a little bit more water to work in there. Some of it is just trial and error to see how good your pie crust comes out. And this is just about ready for a rest. Now I'm going to wrap this in saran wrap and let it cool just for maybe 10 minutes. And then I'll be back and we'll show you how to roll it out. This dough has rested for a little bit. 10 minutes or longer is really better. It allows the flour and the flour to absorb the moisture so they become a little bit better. So now it's going to time to roll this out. I use a dough disc with a cloth on it. You can use wax paper, you can use pastry cloth, you can even use any of those plastic sheets for rolling out dough. And today it's going to be a little more stubborn and want to break a little bit on me. probably could have used to rest a little bit more. There's a little flour is needed to keep my dough from sticking. Not too much, but the edges on this are a little ragged today. And my dough was a little drier than I normally make it. And mostly I like to roll from the center out when I'm making a crust, rather than rolling back and forth a lot, because the edges will grab your rolling pin and you'll tear your dough. And if your dough tears, you can just mend it back together again. If you get a big rip, a little water actually will mend your thing and your dough. And if I get a little V like that, I can patch that in too. I try to be careful and not get the edges too thin. It's very easy to get the edges much thinner than the center. So you can almost feel that on your dough. Like this area is thicker than here. So I'm going to keep working and rolling my dough out and putting flour on my rolling pin as I need to. Until it's the right size for the pie plan that I have. Like I said, I like to make a little extra pie dough. If you have leftover pie dough, you can put it pieces back together again. You can pat it out, put a little cinnamon and sugar on it, and bake it. And it's a nice little treat. My mother always did that for me, and I've done that with my kids. And it's kind of a nice little tasty snack while you're cooking dinner. The recipes will be on my blog, Mountain Mama Knits and Lives. Now, I'm going to check my pie plate against the circle. And it's not quite big enough here, but it's really big there. So I'm going to kind of work this dough around so it's a little bit bigger on this side. And I'll do it this way. And as you can tell, the edges are fragile and they will tear. That's okay. Everybody worries about making a perfect crust. And I think not sweating it is the best way to do it. Okay, now I've got that big enough. I'm actually going to slip my cover off my desk, or you could do this with your wax paper. Or you can fold your pie crust. I'm just going to slip it in here, and then I'm going to work it in and ease it around till I get it to fit exactly how I want. You can also make your pie crust with no butter in it and just lard or just shortening. And it's really a matter of personal taste. It's really in what you happen to have on hand. Now I'm going to trim my crust a little bit along the edges to neaten them up before I start fluting them. And see, raggedy edges aren't going to matter because they're going to get cut off and turned under. Okay, now I'm just going to roll these under like this, and I'm going to start this way. Every time you make a pie crust, it turns out a little different. You never know from one time to the next how your pie is going to actually turn out. And that's kind of the magic of pie making, or even bread making. Amazing, you can start out with just a couple little simple ingredients and have a beautiful, tasty, finished product. you don't have time to let it chill, you don't have to. But if you do, it will improve the quality of the crust. If you have to leave your pie dough in, you make it and then you get distracted or something happens and it sits in there for hours or overnight or a day or two, let it warm up a little bit before you start rolling it, and it'll work just fine. And I'm making an old-fashioned pinched crust here. And there is your